Charting Toward Intimacy covers mature topics. Listener discretion is advised. Have you ever been sitting there and just for a fraction of a second, a thought about sex with your husband flashes into your mind? Maybe it's something like pulling your spouse up to your bedroom and ripping off your clothes as fast as you can. Or maybe it's something more like just a quick flash of desiring to have sex with your husband. But then, just a moment after that flash, your brain shoves that thought away because it is immediately dubbed as an inappropriate thought or not something you should be thinking about at that moment. This situation is called treating a good sexual thought as if it were an intrusive thought. Today, we're going to be talking about how this happens, why it is so common for women who have some experience with purity culture to experience this situation, and how we can transform those thought situations into a more positive thought process in order to further our journey of healing our relationship with sex. Welcome to Charting Toward Intimacy, the sex and intimacy podcast for Catholic women. My name is Ellen Holloway, and I am a Catholic speaker and coach who specializes in sex and marital intimacy. And I am on a mission to help you actually enjoy and desire good, holy sex with your spouse. So, why do we treat good sexual thoughts like intrusive thoughts? And how can we stop doing that? When we realize that purity culture and a twisted understanding of the goodness of the sexual act have impacted how we even allow thoughts about sex into our mind, we can then learn to allow the good thoughts and foster a better relationship with sex overall. So let's get started with today's episode with my co-host, Kathleen Chavanis, joining us. So I think what's going to be helpful to start is let's define what an intrusive thought is. Because I remember I actually didn't even realize this was a thing. I thought this was something only I dealt with. This was like several years ago when someone first used the word intrusive thought to me. So basically, an intrusive thought is just that. It is a thought that just pops into your head, that intrudes on your thinking process and is ridiculous. So if you've ever stood in front of a live microphone in a place that would be incredibly inappropriate to yell a bad word, but you've had this thought of like, oh my gosh, what if I just like yelled a bad word into this microphone? That's an intrusive thought, right? Someone hands you a piece of pottery in a pottery shop and you're like, what would happen if I threw this across the room? That's an intrusive thought. Yeah. That's like, it is ridiculous. You can even have intrusive thoughts. And I know that this is, I mean, I'm not trying to be a psychologist here, but you can have intrusive thoughts of suicide or hurting yourself, and they're not necessarily suicidal thoughts. Like they are truly intrusive thoughts of you're driving on a highway and you just have this intrusive thought of like, what if I just like slammed on the brakes right now? What if I just like turned the wheel? That's not a suicidal thought. That is just like, that's an intrusive thought.
It's just intrusive. Yeah.
It's just intrusive. And it's like, these are not thoughts that you entertain. They pop into your head and then immediately, like, and not even in a conscious way, your brain clamps down on it and goes, this is dumb. This is the dumbest thing ever. You will never follow through with that.
Yeah.
Okay. Would you say that was a decent explanation of an intrusive thought?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that does basically sum it up. I think the struggle with intrusive thoughts is that sometimes they're hard to stop thinking about.
True.
Right? Like, it's just like, they get to be a little bit crazy sometimes in that sense. And that, I mean, I did learn that intrusive thoughts are very common with like OCD diagnoses, and they can be also with like ADHD diagnoses. My own mental health journey has clued me into all of that. So they're interesting. But yeah, I think that's a good summary of them. Let's, I think, continue on into sexual intrusive thoughts or sexually non-intrusive thoughts that we are maybe coining as intrusive thoughts.
Exactly. So then another category of intrusive thoughts are sexual intrusive thoughts. These are truly inappropriate sexual behaviors that just pop into your head. times when it would be inappropriate to be unclothed, or times when would be inappropriate people it would be inappropriate to have sex with, as in, not a spouse. Things that would be inappropriate to do. Those are sexual intrusive thoughts. Now, what we're talking about today is women particularly, but I think that this could also absolutely apply to men who have grown up in kind of a purity culture situation of, all of youth and adolescence was just sort of like, okay, sex is just not something we talk about. Push it to the side. It's not appropriate to talk about. It's not appropriate to think about. Or even further into, sex is bad, sex is dirty. People who have grown up in that, especially women, any thought about sex is treated by the brain as an intrusive thought. So even a fully appropriate thought about wanting to have sex with your husband at a fully appropriate time is treated by the brain as an intrusive thought, because all of youth and adolescence, any thought about sex was considered an intrusive thought by the brain, because it was, quote, not something we're supposed to talk about, not something you're supposed to think about, not appropriate, right? And granted, there's some truth in that certain thoughts about sex as a teen shouldn't necessarily be dived into, right? Like, shouldn't necessarily be entertained, right? But there's also a lot of falsity in that, because it's extremely normal to think about sex. And so, ideally in that situation, in those like youth and teens, they should have been taught how to appropriately entertain those thoughts and kind of recognize them and set them aside. But instead, the survival mechanism that the brain did was just shut it down immediately. The thought pops in the head, clamp it down.
Yeah.
And then they get married. And then those people get married.
Right, yeah. Now, I would say I want to rewind for a second to talk about, like, people who, or how we sort of have grown up in purity culture, right? Like, if you're someone who's grown up in purity culture, if you're anything like me, the experience was that sex it wasn't a no topic. It wasn't something you didn't talk about. But the message, you could have also grown up in purity culture if the message you received in talking about sex was that if you do it, you are broken, right? Like, it was very easily discussed. I mean, I'm thinking like high school retreats, right? There was always a sex talk. There was always it wasn't a sex talk, it was a chastity talk, right? It was the message that every time you do it, you give a piece of your heart away. And so when you get married, how much of your heart is left to give, right? AKA, you are broken. So that was also, I mean, maybe you were able to talk about sex growing up, but you had this fear instilled in you, right? That like, oh, I have to stay away because I need to give myself, I need to be whole for my spouse. I need to not be broken, right? The result ends up being the same, right? Where it's like, no, I'm not going to entertain these thoughts because I need to keep myself whole, right? Like I am irredeemable if I entertain those thoughts. I am broken, right? Like, so yeah, it is such a crazy place to heal from that. And that is like essentially what needs to happen, right? It's not just like a moving on, and like it's a healing that needs to happen. And I mean, I've been married for 11 and a half years and I'm still working on healing that, right? Like when you have grown up your whole life, just, and then all of a sudden it's like you're married and like now you flip the switch, now it's all okay. Like your brain doesn't comprehend that, right? Like it can't comprehend that.
Exactly.
So yeah,
Our
I think
brain
that
is really good at creating pathways. And especially in adolescence, like that is when it's creating most of its pathways. And so, it has created this pathway of something about sex is wrong, right? Either the thought itself at all is totally wrong, or, sex itself is bad and I have to shut that down because I will be broken. And so our brain has created this very strong pathway into literally, I just imagine this like hand clamping down on the thought, like, oh, quiet.
Yeah.
Go away,
Yeah. No, when in my own kind of journey of like healing from, the effects of purity culture and whatnot, I mean, obviously I've had like a lot of talks with my husband, right, about it, and sort of like our struggles, my struggles with just sexuality in general. And he points out that like you don't see yourself as a sexual being. Like you don't allow yourself to be that. Right. And he makes the point that like I have to be like completely horned up to just like, to sort of like let go a little bit and like see myself as that. But that outside of that it's like I can't be a sexual being. And I'm also, dealing with my own fears of like, I mean, my oldest is 10 years old, right? Like she's definitely like kind of coming up on like pre-puberty. She is in pre-puberty, right? Like she's coming up on puberty, and like this whole idea of like, oh my gosh, like my own kid now, like entering into this like reality of being a sexual being is like terrifying to me, right? He's just like, what is your problem? Like this is how like the entire, like everybody does this. And it's like, I know, but I can't handle it. Right. And it's just because of this healing that really needs to happen. But it's like, outside of, like I said, like being like just totally turned on, right? That it is this thing that my brain does where it's just like, you think about it for a second, right? Like just like, oh, it'd be awesome when, my husband comes home to like just head upstairs for a little bit. And then it's just like, no. Like, that's not you. That's not what you do. That's not how we operate. That's not how we work, right? Like, that's what we do is we shut it down. It's like, why don't we operate that way? Why can't we work that way? We are married women to attractive, wonderful men, right? Like, it's like, why can't we operate that way?
I just want to validate that thought because I also have experienced similar things. And I think a lot of you, like you listening, you're probably like, oh my gosh, this totally happened to me before. That is a completely appropriate thought to have about sex with your husband. Like, and we that I think is the first step, is recognizing that thoughts like that, thoughts of, oh, what if we just like ran up to the bedroom real quick, like right when he got home, or, after the kids went to bed, like what if we did something on the couch? Like those are completely appropriate.
They're not intrusive.
They are
intrusive
not
thoughts.
Intrusive.
Yeah.
And that's the point of this conversation, is that the first step is recognizing that the thoughts that we have about sex that are completely appropriate, right? We are in the context of a marriage. Sex is something that is encouraged. Mm-hmm. Those are appropriate, right? Now, yes, there are sexual intrusive thoughts that are inappropriate. If you're thinking of doing something illicit, that's an intrusive thought that's not appropriate. That should be put to the side and like, oh, that's not appropriate, right? You don't need to get angry at yourself. Like, intrusive thoughts are not something we control. They're something that they pop in and out of our head. But you need to just like allow yourself to discern, right? If a thought is intrusive or not.
Yeah.
If it's an appropriate sexual thought, or, if it is something that's like illicit, or, if you have some thought, I mean, these are sort of extreme examples but like, inviting the neighbor over to watch or something like that. Like that's completely inappropriate. And that thought needs to be put to the side.
Yeah.
Hey there. We'll come right back to the episode in a moment. But first, I want you to imagine for just a minute what your marriage would look like if sex just wasn't an issue anymore. Imagine your relationship if sex really served as the beautiful fruit of a loving relationship and it helped both you and your husband grow closer to each other and closer to God every time. There was no more hesitation with sex, no more arguments about sex, no more shame or confusion over pleasure. If that seems like a dream come true, or maybe it even seems too good to be true, I want to invite you to fill out the application for my 12-week one-on-one coaching program and imagine what your marriage could be like after 12 weeks of working one-on-one with me to heal your sexual baggage and grow in understanding of yourself, your relationship, and the role of sex in your marriage. Click the link in the show notes to apply today. You know, it's so funny, Kathleen, you talk about like your experience of purity culture, and it's so true. Like you and I grew up in two different experiences of purity culture, because yours was, like sex here is a thing, but don't do it or you're gonna ruin yourself, right? My high school retreats never had a sex talk.
Wow.
I grew up in a do not talk about it purity culture, right? Like it was just like, that's something that exists, but just absolutely no, just shut it down completely.
Yeah.
And so it's not so much a feeling of, oh, I'm going to be like broken or I'm like messed up if I do this. It's just that like, this is everything about this. This is what I grew up with, right? Is just completely inappropriate. And it's just like, that's just absolutely not something that I should do. And I think those are two like very common, very valid experiences of kind of growing up in a disordered view of sexuality culture. That's really what it is. It's not purity culture, because purity is great. Like,
that's
purity
true.
is a virtue.
That's true. Yeah. No,
it's just been like
very true.
Called purity culture, but truly it's a disordered view of sexuality. So I just want to go back to something you were saying about accepting ourselves as sexual beings. I'm going to share a little story time for you all.
Woohoo.
When I was in high school, Zumba was like, had really come on the scene. Like it was like, it was the new super fun thing to do. And my mom loved it. And so she got me a gym membership, and like I joined in and I was loving it. I love dancing. My parents are professional ballroom dancers. Like I grew up dancing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you probably didn't know that about me.
No, I didn't know that. Yeah. That's cool.
And so I was like, this is great. Exercise and dancing together. I'm all about this. And I remember feeling this like wrestling inside of me in these Zumba classes, because some of the moves of Zumba are on the more sexual side. Not necessarily like inappropriately sexual, but it's like, it's very much like embracing your body as a woman. And I know men do Zumba, but a lot of these moves are very female. Like lots of hip movement, Latin dance. I mean, like if you go, my background is ballroom dance, right? Cha-cha, rumba, those dances are very hip heavy. And so there's a lot of like, they're very sensual. There's a lot of moving of, your sexual body, and like, and recognizing like, these are the parts of my body that are like sexual, that are associated with my femaleness, right? My hips, my, those are very associated with me being a woman.
Yeah.
And I remember having this wrestling in these classes of wanting to just jump in and like fully do these dance moves of lots of hip movement and just like get into these songs, but then also this complete discomfort with moving my body that way because of a lack of accepting myself and my body as a sexual being. Funnily enough, I went on to become a Zumba instructor, and that was still something I struggled with.
That's so
Isn't that great?
Funny.
Because I loved it.
Yeah.
I felt the pull of the goodness of it, right? And I actually think that was a bit of a helpful thing in my journey, but it was still something I wrestled with constantly. And as an instructor, I could choose the songs, right? So I often would shy away from the more sensual songs because I didn't feel comfortable myself doing those moves and things like that. But I tell all of this of just to allow you into my story a little bit and just see yourself in that story. Maybe you weren't at a Zumba class with your mom. But where in your life have you not accepted yourself as a sexual being? You are sexed as a woman, as a man.
Yeah.
You are sexed. That is being human.
Mm-hmm.
We're made in the image and likeness of God. Male and female, he created them. By being male and female, this gender difference that we have is part of our being the image of God. You know, by coming together as man and woman, we're able to image God in an even deeper way than just individually. Like with this communion of persons, we have this deeper image that we're able to create of God. But in order to do that, one of the first steps is just recognizing I am a sexual being. I have parts of my body that are inherently female, and they are so good.
And, you know, it's like, how do you do that? Right? Like, how do you do that? It's like, what are the practical steps? I'll take notes, right? But here's the thing, like it all starts in the brain. Like we've said it before, right? That like the brain is our most sexual organ, right? Like everything starts there. And so it takes changing your way of thinking and changing your brain, right? This is literally what we do in like therapy, right? Like cognitive behavioral therapy, like you are changing the pathways in your brain, and it's hard to do. So I think that the first thing is recognizing what's true about yourself, right? It is true that you are a sexual being. It is true that God made you a sexual being. And it is also true that everything that God made is good, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe start, if you are someone who's struggling with this, as we all are.
On some level, you are struggling with a disordered view of sexuality.
Yeah.
I can guarantee that because we're human.
Exactly. But write down the things that you know are true that you may not believe, right? Or that you may not understand. Write them down and read them every day to yourself. Read them.
Or write them every day. Like the process of writing is so good for our brain. Like just like get a little journal that's like just for this and just like write the same things over and over and over again every single day.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's phenomenal. Like to write it every day, embody it almost like envision it for yourself. Like, right. Like what does me being a sexual being perfectly created by God in that way mean for me or look like for me, right? Like how can I celebrate that? And then also like the second most important thing is to give yourself grace, because this is really hard work that does require practice, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and when you're practicing something, it means you are not yet proficient at it, right? Like, so allow yourself to practice this, right? Because you're not, and be graceful with yourself, right? Like accept that, okay, I am not perfect in this yet, but I can continue to practice until it almost becomes not only second nature, but just believed by yourself. Mm-hmm. Like that's what I've always struggled with in like cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Is like, okay, I can tell myself these things over and over, but I don't believe them, you know? And that's the hard part, is like telling yourself before you believe it so that you get to believe it. If that makes sense. It's kind of like a lot, but
absolutely.
Yeah.
I like the word that you used, which was we need to embody these thoughts, because that is absolutely true. Because we are a body-soul unity. We are not a soul trapped in, a meat skeleton. We are, you are your body and your soul united, right? Like the rupture of the body and soul That's a heresy. Like, that's called Manichaeism. When we try to separate the body and soul and say that, like, the body is bad and the spirit soul is good. That's Manichaeism. Yeah. Like, your body is so good. And we need to allow ourselves to be an embodied soul, an incarnate soul, right? The incarnation was God taking on a body, becoming a body. We are incarnate. In, meaning, you know, inside carne, meat, but right. But in a body, we are a body. And that, I think, one of the big issues that, you know, the purity culture, the disordered view of sexuality, one of the biggest issues that is so common is this idea, this ruptured idea that, like, the spirit is good, but, like, the body is bad. And, like, we go to the gospel, St. Paul, not gospel, I'm sorry. This is in one of his letters. Yeah. St. Paul talks about, you know, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And we can read those things and misinterpret what they mean because our current language speaks about the body differently than, like, what those words would have actually meant to the people at that time. Translations are hard. And so we read some of those things and we're like, oh my gosh, the Bible says that the spirit is good and the body is bad. And like, things of the flesh are bad. That's not what that means. It means that, you know, we're fallen humans. That's essentially what that means. And that's, I think, for a conversation for another time. But what I wanted to just really get at is just that we have to recognize and continue to remind ourselves that, like, we are a body soul unity and our body is us. Like, this is why the whole transgender movement is just bonkers. Like, it literally doesn't make sense because you are your body. You are not trapped in you're not a woman trapped in a man's body, a man trapped in a woman's body. You are your body. Like, your body is you. Mm-hmm. You can't be trapped in it.
Yeah.
Again, that's a conversation for another time. But
I was like, wow, we took a little turn here.
I know.
But it was important. It's an important point.
I went down the rabbit hole there a little bit. But I think just to wrap up this conversation, right? Your body is good. You are a sexual being. God created you to be a sexual being. He created you as female. He created you as male. And that is you. Your body is you, and that is good. And the thoughts that we have about sex that are fully appropriate, the thoughts that we have about
with our spouse,
right? Doing illicit things, right? Pulling your spouse up to the bedroom right after they get home from work. Those are so appropriate and so good. Those thoughts are so good. And that actually we should strive to foster those because those will help us to grow in holy desire for our spouse. And so allow those thoughts to happen. Allow yourself to think about sex in appropriate ways and really just embrace the fact that you are a sexual being.
Thanks so much for listening. If you are not already following us on Instagram, be sure to check us out at Charting Toward Intimacy. And if you listen to podcasts on a platform that gives you the option to rate or review, we'd love for you to do that because it helps us spread the word about the podcast. If you ever have questions, comments, or episode topic ideas, please reach out to us. We love to hear from you. You can reach out on Instagram or send us an email. Our email is in the show notes. Until next time.